In a world of lavish celebrity birthdays, Barron Trump's 17th stood apart. No paparazzi or red carpets graced this event. Instead, New York City's bustling streets witnessed an unusual scene. Thousands of hungry children, mountains of food, and a young man determined to make a difference. As Barron set out to feed the city's orphans, he faced a challenge greater than logistics. The skepticism and political tensions lingering in the air threatened to overshadow his efforts. Could one act of kindness overcome years of animosity and prove the sincerity of his intentions? The sun rose on a crisp New York morning, casting long shadows across the city's towering skyscrapers. Inside Trump Tower, Barron Trump stirred in his bed, his eyes flickering open to greet the day. But this wasn't just any day. It was his 17th birthday. Yet, as he lay there surrounded by luxury, there was no excitement, no anticipation of celebration. Instead, his mind raced with plans that defied expectations. Barron swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. As he dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, doubt crept in. Could he really pull this off? The weight of his decision pressed down on him, making each movement feel heavier than usual. He caught his reflection in the mirror, determination and fear mingling in his eyes. The enormity of what he was about to do settled on his shoulders. Barron's fingers hovered over his phone, tempted to call it all off. It would be so easy to slip back into the comfortable routine of a privileged birthday celebration. But as he hesitated, memories flooded his mind. Countless headlines about his family flashed before his eyes, each one a reminder of the intense public scrutiny that had been a constant presence in his life. He recalled overheard conversations, whispers in school hallways, the judgment in people's eyes when they learned his last name. With a deep breath, he made the call that would set everything in motion. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke to the event planner, canceling the lavish birthday celebration. As he hung up, a mix of relief and anxiety washed over him. Barron's inspiration had come from an unexpected source. Weeks earlier, he had stumbled upon a documentary about child poverty in New York City. The images of children his own age, struggling for basic necessities, had haunted him. It was a world so far removed from his own, yet existing just blocks away from the tower he called home. That night, unable to sleep, Barron had made a decision. He would use his birthday, a day that had always been about receiving, and transform it into a day of giving. The plan had formed quickly, to organize a massive food drive for orphanages across the city. It was ambitious, perhaps even naive, but it felt right in a way nothing else had before. As Barron approached the local charity office, his newfound confidence began to waver. The bustling city streets faded into the background, replaced by the daunting task ahead. He pushed open the heavy glass door, the cool air inside a stark contrast to the warm summer day he left behind. The receptionist's eyes widened in recognition, her polite smile faltering for just a moment. "I'm here to see the director," Barron said, his voice steadier than he felt. The woman nodded, reaching for the phone with a slightly trembling hand. Moments later, he was ushered into a small, cluttered office where a stern-faced woman sat behind a desk piled high with papers. The charity director's cold demeanor spoke volumes about her expectations. Her steely gaze seemed to pierce right through Barron, sizing him up with a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed disdain. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. "Why should we trust you?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Barron fumbled for words, his carefully prepared speech suddenly inadequate in the face of such open hostility. He felt the weight of his last name threatening to crush his genuine intentions. I want to help," he began, his voice catching slightly. "I know what you must think of me, of my family, but—" The director's eyes narrowed, scanning for any sign of insincerity. "We've had our fair share of publicity stunts masquerading as charity, Mr. Trump. What makes you any different?" Memories of past Trump family controversies flashed through Barron's mind. The scandals, the accusations, the constant media scrutiny, all of it threatened to overwhelm him in that moment. But something else stirred within him, a determination born from the very documentary that had set him on this path. In a moment of vulnerability, Barron shared a personal story that surprised even himself. When I was younger, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, I used to sneak out of Trump Tower. Not for parties or anything like that. I'd go to this little park a few blocks away. The director leaned forward, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. There was this group of kids who'd play there every day after school. They didn't have much. Worn-out clothes, shoes with holes. But they were always laughing, always sharing what little they had. Barron's eyes grew distant, lost in the memory. I never joined them. I was too scared, too aware of how different I was. But I watched them, and I realized how sheltered my life had been. He met the director's gaze, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. I can't change my name or my past, but I can use what I have to make a difference. That's all I'm asking for. A chance to do something real. The room fell silent as the director considered his words. Finally, she nodded, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. All right, Mr. Trump, let's talk about how we can make this work. As Barron left the office an hour later, a small victory under his belt, he knew the real work was just beginning. The director's final words echoed in his mind. Actions speak louder than words. Show us what you're made of. As Barron stepped out of the charity's office, the world outside had transformed. A sea of faces greeted him, their expressions a mix of anger, disbelief, and suspicion. The air crackled with tension, and Barron felt his newfound resolve begin to waver. Signs bobbed in the air, their messages etched in bold, accusatory letters. Trump's charity, another con, one read. No more lies, declared another. The crowd's energy was palpable, a living, breathing entity that seemed to pulse with each passing moment. Chants of, "Go home, Trump," echoed off the surrounding buildings, growing louder with each repetition. Barron's security team shifted nervously, their eyes darting from face to face in the crowd. They formed a tight circle around him, but it did little to shield him from the wave of hostility. The cacophony of voices swelled, punctuated by the sharp clap of protest signs colliding. A woman near the front, her face contorted with anger, locked eyes with Barron. "You think you can buy our forgiveness with a few sandwiches?" she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. Barron's heart raced, his palms slick with sweat. The urge to retreat, to return to the safety of his privileged life, was overwhelming. He had hoped for understanding, maybe even support. Instead, he faced a wall of skepticism and anger. In that moment, Barron saw the years of pent-up frustration and distrust etched on the faces before him. He felt the weight of actions that weren't his own pressing down on his shoulders. The woman's words echoed in his mind, challenging him to prove her wrong. Barron knew he had a choice to make. He could turn back, admit defeat, and let the cynics win. Or he could stand his ground and fight for what he believed in. With shaking hands and a deep breath, Barron stepped forward. The chants died down, replaced by a thick, anticipatory silence. All eyes were on him, waiting to see what the youngest Trump would do next. The crowd's jeers faded as Barron retreated into a small office, the door closing behind him with a soft click. For the first time since he'd embarked on this journey, he was alone with his thoughts. The silence was deafening, amplifying the doubts that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind. Barron's hands trembled as he sank into a worn leather chair, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. The weight of expectation, of skepticism, of his family's legacy, it all came crashing down on his shoulders. He closed his eyes, but the faces of the angry protesters still danced behind his eyelids, their words echoing in his ears. Was I naive to think I could make a difference? He whispered to the empty room. Maybe they're right. Maybe this is all just a mistake. Memories of his sheltered childhood flooded his mind. The gilded halls of Trump Tower, the private tutors, the carefully curated experiences, all of it seemed a world away from the harsh realities he now faced. How could he, Barron Trump, truly understand the struggles of those he sought to help? He recalled the documentary that had sparked this journey, the images of children his age fighting for survival on the very streets he'd driven past countless times. But now, confronted with the raw anger and distrust of the public, those noble intentions felt painfully inadequate. Barron's gaze fell on his reflection in a dusty mirror hanging on the wall. The face that stared back at him seemed both familiar and foreign. Was he really cut out for this? Or was he just play-acting at charity, a privileged teenager woefully unprepared for the complexities of the real world? The harsh words of critics replayed in his mind, each one a dagger to his resolve. "It's just another publicity stunt," a woman had sneered. "They think they can buy our forgiveness with a few sandwiches," a man had shouted. Each accusation felt like a blow, chipping away at his confidence. In the depths of his uncertainty, Barron's mind wandered to a memory he'd almost forgotten. Years ago, he'd snuck out of Trump Tower, drawn by the laughter of children in a nearby park. He'd watched from afar, captivated by their carefree play despite their worn clothes and shoes with holes. That day, he'd felt a spark, a desire to bridge the gap between his world and theirs. As that memory resurfaced, something stirred within Barron, a small voice of determination, refusing to be silenced by doubt. It whispered of the potential for change, of the power of genuine compassion to overcome even the deepest mistrust. Barron stood, his reflection in the mirror transforming before his eyes. The scared, uncertain boy was still there, but alongside him stood someone new, someone determined to prove that actions truly do speak louder than words. He grabbed a pen and paper, his hand steady now as he began to write. This wasn't just about handing out sandwiches anymore. He would create a program to truly connect with those he wanted to help, to learn from them as much as he hoped to assist them. It was time to build bridges, not walls. As Barron left the small office, determination burned within him. Yet, the world beyond held challenges he couldn't have imagined. How long could his idealism survive against temptation? Exhaustion seeped into Barron's bones as the day wore on. His phone buzzed incessantly, reminding him of the life he'd left behind. Messages showcased poolside lounging and lavish parties, a stark contrast to New York's gritty streets. Barron found himself before Trump Tower, its golden facade gleaming amid the city's chaos. Every detail spoke of luxury: polished brass, immaculate marble floors, an air of exclusivity. His hand hovered over the door handle. One push, he thought, and this experiment in altruism would be over. He imagined the plush comfort of his bed, high thread count sheets, perfect climate control. The thought was intoxicating. It would be so easy to retreat, he mused, feeling the weight of his choice. A child's laughter cut through his reverie. Barron saw a small family across the street, a little girl in worn sneakers skipping along the sidewalk, her tired but smiling mother behind. Suddenly, Trump Tower felt suffocating. Barron turned away, each step heavy, but his resolve strengthening. He had made a promise to himself, to the boy who watched other children from behind tinted windows, to the teenager who felt a spark of empathy ignite. As he walked back towards his work, Barron felt exhausted, yet exhilarated. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt truly alive, connected to a greater purpose. The sun dipped below the horizon as Barron approached the small community center, its faded brick exterior a stark contrast to the opulent world he'd left behind. Inside, worn linoleum floors creaked under his feet as volunteers bustled about, setting up tables and chairs. As Barron stepped through the doors, conversations hushed. Whispers followed him as he made his way to the serving line. Determined to prove himself, he grasped the utensils with trembling hands. The other volunteers watched warily, their bodies tense. The first hours crawled by in awkward silence. Just as Barron's resolve began to waver, a young girl approached his station. No more than 7 years old, she stood on tiptoe, her eyes wide with curiosity and hunger. As Barron filled her plate, their gazes met. The girl's smile, bright and genuine, cut through the tension like a warm ray of sunshine after a storm. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity that caught Barron off guard. In that moment, he saw the real impact of his efforts, not in grand gestures, but in the gratitude of a child who would go to bed with a full stomach that night. A lump formed in his throat as he realized the true significance of what he was doing. As if that smile had broken a spell, the energy in the room began to shift. The other volunteers relaxed, their actions becoming less guarded. Conversations started to flow more freely, and Barron found himself engaged in discussions about the community's needs and challenges. As the night wore on, laughter began to fill the once silent room. Barron shared stories of his own childhood dreams, finding common ground with people he never imagined he'd connect with. The barriers of preconception slowly crumbled, replaced by a shared sense of purpose and humanity. The sky was just beginning to lighten as Barron Trump stood at the edge of Central Park, his heart racing with anticipation and nervousness. Before him stretched a sea of white tents and long tables, a testament to months of planning and hard work. Volunteers scurried about, making last-minute preparations for the massive feeding event that would soon unfold. As the early morning mist began to lift, revealing the full scale of the operation, Barron felt a mix of pride and trepidation. This was it, the culmination of his journey, the moment that would define whether his efforts had truly made a difference. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the day ahead. The first arrivals began to trickle in, families with young children, elderly couples supporting each other, and individuals who looked like they hadn't had a proper meal in days. Barron watched as they were greeted warmly by volunteers and directed to various stations. For a moment, it seemed as though everything was going according to plan. But then, a commotion near the park's entrance caught his attention. A group of protesters, their faces set in grim determination, pushed their way to the front of the gathering crowd. Their shouts grew louder, threatening to overshadow the day's purpose. "Trump's charity is a sham! Go back to your golden tower! You can't buy our forgiveness!" The angry voices cut through the air, drawing concerned looks from volunteers and those waiting in line for food. Barron's security team moved to intervene, forming a protective barrier around him, but he held up a hand to stop them. He knew that this moment would define everything he had worked for. With his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, Barron stepped forward. The crowd parted, all eyes fixed on the young man as he approached the group of protesters. The lead protester, a middle-aged woman with lines of anger etched deep into her face, stood her ground, her gaze boring into Barron with years of pent-up resentment. "I know you're angry," Barron began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I know you have every reason not to trust me or my family, but today isn't about me, and it's not about my last name. It's about making sure that no one in this city goes hungry, even if it's just for one day." He paused, looking around at the faces surrounding him. Some hostile, some curious, some desperate for help. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or praise. I'm just asking for a chance to do something good. If you want to protest, I understand. But please, don't let it stop people from getting the help they need today." The woman's expression flickered, a mix of surprise and uncertainty, replacing the anger for a moment. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see how this unexpected drama would unfold. Barron stood there, vulnerable and exposed, knowing that everything hinged on what happened next. As the sun dipped below the New York skyline, Central Park bore witness to a sight that defied imagination. The very same hands that had raised protest signs now worked in harmony alongside longtime volunteers, distributing meals and sharing smiles. What had begun as a day of tension and skepticism had transformed into something profoundly moving, a testament to the power of genuine compassion. Barron Trump stood at the edge of the park, his eyes sweeping over the scene before him. Exhaustion tugged at his limbs, but a spark of exhilaration coursed through his veins. The white tents that had earlier seemed like fortresses of division now served as beacons of unity. Families gathered around tables, their laughter floating on the evening breeze. Children darted between the legs of adults, their faces alight with joy, a stark contrast to the images of struggle that had haunted Barron's thoughts for weeks. A woman approached Barron, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was wrong about you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "We all were. Thank you for not giving up on us." Barron felt a lump form in his throat, unable to find words to respond. Instead, he simply nodded, offering a smile that spoke volumes. As the night wore on, Barron found himself surrounded by a growing circle of people, eager to share their stories. An elderly man recounted how he had lost his job during the pandemic, his pride preventing him from seeking help until today. A single mother whispered her gratitude, explaining how this meal meant her children wouldn't go to bed hungry for the first time in weeks. Each tale etched itself into Barron's heart, reinforcing the importance of the work they had done. The weight of the past week's struggles began to lift from Barron's shoulders, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. He realized that this day wasn't just about feeding the hungry, it was about nourishing the soul of a city that had been starved for connection and understanding. As the final rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Barron knew it was time to address the crowd one last time. He made his way to the center of the park, where a makeshift stage had been set up. The buzz of conversation died down as people noticed his approach, all eyes turning to the young man who had defied their expectations. Barron took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The words he had prepared seemed inadequate in the face of the day's events. Instead, he decided to speak from the heart, his voice carrying across the hushed park. "Today, we came together not as separate groups divided by our differences, but as one community united by our shared humanity," Barron began, his voice trembling slightly. "I stand before you not as a Trump, but as a fellow New Yorker who believes in the power of kindness and the strength of our city." As the last volunteer departed, Barron Trump stood alone in Central Park, the weight of the day's events settling upon him. The once bustling grounds now lay silent, save for the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. He gazed at the empty tables, remnants of meals still visible, each a testament to a hunger sated, a connection forged. The young man's reflection rippled in a nearby pond, revealing a face transformed. Gone was the sheltered boy from Trump Tower. In his place stood someone who had tasted the bittersweet reality of public service. The day had not merely fed thousands, it had nourished the very soul of New York City, bridging divides that once seemed insurmountable.